presidents of the Recording Industry Association of America, the PMRC, and the 5.6 million National PTA. And all those groups hope and believe it will work. An agreement was reached and announced this past Friday on November the 1st. We believe this is a victory for the artists, the manufacturer, the industry, and for parents. It involves no change from what has been recorded or would otherwise have been recorded unless the artist wants to. The individual recording companies will identify recordings with lyrics that are related to explicit sex, explicit violence, and explicit substance abuse, and will bear an inscription that says explicit lyrics, parental advisory. As an option, the company may imprint the lyrics on the back cover of an album or print lyrics on an insert that would be displayed visibly. Because space does not permit the display of such lyrics on the cassette, the tape cassettes will bear the imprint CLP for lyrics when the LP counterpart of that cassette displays such lyrics. We know it requires anywhere from 60 to 90 days to implement this, but we think this is a healthy, reasonable, and important step to accomplish the minimum needs of parents with younger children with minimum intrusion upon artistic freedom. Even Danny Goldberg of the Musical Majority has stated publicly that he can go along with the lyrics alternative. My friend Frank Zappa here has been using the label alternative for a while, even though his choice of words on his label is somewhat different from ours. Be glad to answer questions later.
Thank you, Ms. Nubius. The next speaker is a music composer, as you might have guessed. He is the president of Barking Pumpkin Records. And I recently tonight found out that he owns a company called Intercontinental Absurdities. So we are certainly pleased to have with us tonight Mr. Frank Zappa.
Thank you. Is this one working? Can you hear me? All right. Well, when I was at the Senate hearing on the 19th, I suggested, and this was actually the idea of my attorney, that they print the lyrics on the back of the album, and also said that if you're going to print them, you should pay the people who write them and the people who publish them, something that was never dealt with seriously at the hearing. You can't expect to arrive at an agreement with the recording industry where they're going to print lyrics on the back and force somebody to give up the right to earn a living from doing that. Some of you may or may not know that people who sing songs do not always write the songs that they sing, and the ownership and the right to earn money from the words to those songs may reside other places. For example, with another songwriter, with another publisher, or the rights may have been sublet to a songwriter magazine. So the actual rights to these lyrics are spread out all over the countryside, creating quite a dilemma if you're going to mandate putting lyrics on the back of a record. Now, let's talk about their little advisory. About 2 months ago, the record industry offered to put something on an album that said, parental guidance, explicit lyrics. Their new advisory says, explicit lyrics, parental advisory. Does the industry need to be dragged through the Senate in order to change that one word? The rest, I'm reading to you from the Associated Press wire copy that was handed to me on November 1st because I was asked to comment on this for a number of interviews, and at least they gave me something to talk about. I've then followed what was printed in the newspapers various places, and they haven't printed everything that was actually put into the wire copy. The Los Angeles Times, for example, left out 2 important lines of what was actually agreed upon. Here's what it says. The record companies will decide what constitutes explicit. There are no guidelines. That's what you got right now. What's explicit is explicit, said Stanley M. Gordikoff, president of the Recording Industry Association of America. Those singers whose contracts give them control over the design of the album cover are free to ignore the understanding. Some would call that a loophole. Record companies may skip the special advisory if they print the exact words on the album cover. Now, some of you who have albums know that in some instances the words are on the back cover, and usually in those instances the guy who sang the song and made the record owns the words so he can do whatever he wants with them. We'll skip over to here. Tipper Gore, wife of Senator Albert Gore, Democrat, Tennessee, told reporters that the parents' group would have no role in defining explicit. So that leaves it all in the hands of the record company, and I think they've done okay so far. Then it says, Mrs. Hauer said her group would monitor the record industry's compliance with the agreement, and said letter writing campaigns and other pressures would be put on artists and companies that do not go along with it. Got a little problem there. You don't have to go along with it according to the agreement. So they're threatening to put pressure on people who don't go along with something that you don't have to go along with. In the last line of the release, rock musician Frank Zappa and Dee Snider of the Twisted Sister rock group are among those whose music has come under fire. I do not recall ever being fired upon in this particular war. And so that is the magnificent victory for the parent and the industry and the artist that they were talking about that occurred on November the 1st. And the press has been very eager to say, okay, we've made this big agreement and it's all going to be nice, and in 60 to 90 days it's all going to be fine. Then on November 2nd in the New York Times you read a statement from a man named Fernandez, who is a staffer for Senator Hollings, that he's going to be looking to see if there isn't proper compliance. He's still going for legislation. He opted for legislation in an article on 10/24/85 in Variety. His legislation would demand that lyrics be printed on albums. I read that article. I called his office. I talked with a girl named Cheryl Wallace, who is his staffer. She was the one actually writing the bill. I told her of a conversation that I had with a man named Leonard Feist, who was the highest ranking guy I could find at the National Music Publishers Association. And he told me that not only was there not an established statutory rate for printing lyrics on the back of an album cover, he's the one who told me that the rights were spread out all over the place. So it would be very difficult to legislate that unless you just wanted to take everybody's contract and burn it. So I told Cheryl Wallace that, and she had not researched it as well as I had. She said, oh, that's sort of different. And I said, I think the best thing you should do with this legislation is to let it evaporate. And her reply was, well, you never know what happens to these bills. They go in and you never know what gets added to them when they come out. And I said, what do you mean, like a little tobacco subsidy at the end? All right. I have been speaking on this topic for a long time. I'm really getting tired of it, probably more tired than you are, because I make mine up every time I go along and you're reading the same speech. But maybe that's easier. Well, it's true, because I believe I heard a large quantity of that in Mrs. Baker's testimony at the Senate. Is that correct? Not a little, not a large. Okay, well, you know, it's put together out of a kit. So. And I'm not attempting to be rude, I'm stating facts. Now, I'm going to tell you about a little conversation that I had a couple of days ago. I had the great misfortune to spend 2 hours doing a phone-in radio show in Canada with Wayne Grigsby in Montreal. The name of the show was Cross Country Checkup, where people all over Canada, from Newfoundland to Vancouver to the Yukon Territory, could phone in toll-free and state their opinion on this matter. I was amazed at some of the things that I heard, because it looks like they're revving up for the same sort of foolishness up there. Now here's what I heard. 2 teachers, one of them was the principal of his school, come out and say, wide open, I'm in favor of censorship, and the principal of the school said, if children play rock music in my school, I take drastic action. Don't go to Canada. It's dangerous. Then they had a psychiatrist named Dr. Abe Warren Klein, who was in Toronto, and he was waiting at home for his phone call, and he gets on the line, and he was telling about things that he had experienced in his practice. And this is not theory, we're talking clinical practice now. He said this, that in instances where parents also consumed rock music and tried to act in an adolescent way, it tended to drive their children toward heavy metal and into more extreme forms of rock music. So we begin to see a psychological profile of the type of a parent who would want to have somebody else take care of this imagined problem. The more people who will take care of their children for them, the more time they get to have being an adolescent. And so they can have their own rock music and they don't have to listen to that extreme stuff their children are listening to. What else we got here? The main thing that you have to bear in mind about the timing of all of these events is the connection to the Mathias Bill, which was heard on the 30th, just a little while before the famous press conference on the 1st. The Mathias Bill, if you have been following this, is the blank tape tax. And that has really been the crux of the biscuit all along here. The original threatening letter from the PMRC sent to the RIAA was designed to let them know that their legislation, which could provide a large amount of money for no work whatsoever to the recording industry, was going to be in the hands of the husbands of the women who signed this letter. So we have a little bit of extortion there. You also have a little bit of conflict of interest when the Senate committee that heard the matter on the 19th had 5 senators married to signatories to the original PMRC letter. And it wasn't easy to find out that there were 5 on there. I had to dig and scrape to find out that there were 3, and I didn't find out until after the hearing that actually there were 5. Hollings is 1, Tribble is 1, Danforth is 1, Packwood is 1, and Gore is 1. Packwood I didn't see at the hearing, so I guess he's okay. But the rest of them were there, and the 2 that were unknown, which were Hollings and Tribble, acted at the hearing as if, this is a bright, fresh new idea that had just sort of popped up out of nowhere. And, and people were talking out of both sides of their mouth as to whether or not legislation was wanted or was being planned or whatever. Danforth he was the chairman, he opened the hearing by saying, the purpose of this hearing is to ventilate the issue. We don't want legislation. Thank you very much. Next, Hollings. Yeah, I'm interested in legislation. It's outrageous filth, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. A little later, you hear Senator Exon say, what is the purpose of these hearings in front of the Commerce Committee? Our job is legislation. That is the business of this committee. So before I read my testimony, which had made mention of a conflict of interest, I was going to omit that from my testimony if, in fact, there was not going to be any recommendation for legislation. I asked Senator Danforth, some of you might have seen part of this on the C-SPAN, I asked Senator Danforth whether or not legislation was wanted, and he sort of said, well, just go on and read it. So I said, okay, if I can't get a straight answer. And then, it was then when Exon said, I, for one, favor legislation and would be happy to join in conjunction with Senator Hollings or anybody else here who wanted legislation. He wants it. I said, okay, you want it, you got it. I accuse you. Conflict of interest. That's what it is. That's my opening statement.
As I said at the opening, Dr. Radecki was not able to be with us this evening, but he did phone here, and he does know